I bought this EXA 500 camera as part of a job lot of camera stuff a few years ago, and it's been sitting since then waiting to be repaired. The grease in the focusing helicoid is dry, so you can hardly focus the lens. There's also dirt and fungus in the lens, so it'll need a careful clean. The camera is generally a bit dirty, but the main issue is the shutter, which has a few issues. Unlike the earlier EXA cameras, such as my Model 6, which has what I've seen described as a guillotine shutter that only goes up to 1/150th of a second, the EXA 500 has a vertical focal plane shutter that goes up to, you've guessed it, 1/500th of a second. If I pop the back off, which almost seems too easy on this camera because you just rotate this ring surrounding the tripod mount and off it comes. If I now take a shot at 1/500th of a second, it's actually working, although it wasn't earlier. The front curtain had a lot of drag and the rear curtain would catch up with it before the end of the frame, which would of course have led to unexposed areas on the film, so it must have freed up a little through use. If I now set it to 1/15th of a second, and wind the film advancing lever, and fire, that's a very slow 1/15th of a second. And if I repeat that, setting the camera to half a second, it sticks open. Occasionally it will close a few seconds later, but not every time. This is a pretty normal problem with the slow speed shutter timer that affects many old cameras. Some are easier to fix than others. So it's time to do a little work on the camera. This won't so much be a how-to video, I'll just show some of the work I do in the hopes that it's helpful or interesting to a few people. I've not worked on one of these EXA cameras before, so I'll be figuring it out as I go along. I won't include every detail because no one wants to watch as I spend half an hour figuring out how the next bit comes apart, but I'll try to include the most interesting bits. I'll start off by cleaning the exterior of the camera, which you don't need to see, so I'll return in a moment. I'm guessing that the first thing is to get the top off, which of course will need the controls to come off first. There's a screw underneath the film rewind lever, and I wouldn't be surprised to find another one hidden beneath this bit of trim on the frame counter. Actually, I'll look at that off camera because I don't want to damage the bit of trim. Okay, there wasn't a screw under that bit of trim, so there must be another way of releasing the film advancing lever. But after a closer examination, I think the entire lower section of the body can be removed. There are 2 screws on the back, and another 2 on the front, and then there are 4 more slightly less obvious screws, 2 in the top of each film chamber. It varies greatly on how different cameras come apart, and even the earlier EXAs may well be different to this EXA 500, which dates from somewhere around 1967. They also sold this camera as the Exakta 500, whereas previously the Exaktas had been the more sophisticated siblings of the EXAs, so I'm not sure why they used both brand names on this model. Okay, now to test the theory. Well, actually I did a dry run before filming this bit, so I know it works. And with a bit of careful jiggling, off comes the lower body to reveal the entire shutter mechanism. The toothed film drive shaft is easier to install after refitting the lower body rather than at the same time, but I'll try to remember to show that later on. The slow speed shutter timer is this section, with a hairspring to provide the power, and an escapement wheel just like a clock over here. On some cameras, such as the EXA Reflex, the entire slow speed timer can be removed for cleaning in alcohol, but this one looks like it has to come apart, and the less I have to do with that hairspring the better. It already looks kinked, as if someone has tampered with it previously, so I'll try to clean it all in situ. All the bearings for the rollers that guide the shutter ribbons look dirty and dry, so I'll clean and re-oil those in a bit. If I trigger the shutter with the camera in bulb setting, the rear curtain should close as soon as I release the button, but there's quite a delay as the rear curtain is held by this lever, which is part of the slow speed shutter timer. and flipped back over to the other side with the shutter speed set at half a second, and find my way to the trigger lever. The slow speed shutter timer starts off all enthusiastic, but then it just runs out of puff, and I need to give it a helping hand before the rear shutter will go up. So while trying not to get in the way of the camera, I'll put a couple of drops of IPA onto the gears, and then operate the shutter. And then repeat this process a few times in an attempt to clean off most of the dirt and grime. The escapement wheel is the most critical one because it's at the end of the drive chain and therefore has the least power, so I'll carefully brush that after applying the IPA to remove as much of the softened dirt as possible. And after the first batch of cleaning, I'll re-oil the bearing surfaces, carrying a small drop of oil on the end of a screwdriver. Actually, that was way too much oil. I should have used my clock oiler, which is kind of like a screwdriver but much finer. Anyway, I'll remove the excess before it goes places that I don't want it. The hairspring, like on many watches and smaller clocks, has a friction fit collar in the middle that can be rotated to adjust the amount of tension. It's still not sitting very well, and I still think it's been tampered with in the past. But if I now wind on and release the shutter, it is now working. So I'll carry on and do the rest of the cleaning and oiling, and then test the shutter mechanism in a bit. Okay, that's everything oiled and cleaned, and all the shutter speeds are doing what they should be doing. If I select bulb, the shutter remains open until I release the trigger when it snaps shut. So wind on and select half a second, and that's good enough. Now for 1/4 of a second, and that's fine. 1/8 of a second, 1/15 of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/125th of a second, 1/250th of a second, and finally 1/500th of a second. Those all seem about right. I could go to extra effort to check them for accuracy, but even if they're half a stop or so out, it's not that big a deal. It's not as if you have 1/3 of a stop increments on these old cameras, and film is relatively forgiving. So I'll get the camera put back together, and then it'll be time to turn my attention to the lens. As I mentioned earlier, it's a little easier to remove the bracket for the film sprocket shaft and install that once the body is back together. Then, making sure the shutter button is in place, it's time to ease the bottom back onto the camera. Which of course went together much easier when I did a dry run earlier on. Anyway, that's it back in position. I'll pop a drop of oil on the end of the sprocket shaft and then try to find the correct angle to get it through the hole. And I'll loosely refit the bottom bracket, and no, it's not a bicycle, but I won't tighten that until the rest of the camera is screwed together. Then it's just a case of refitting the 8 screws and we're all done. And just for a quick sanity check, here are the slower shutter speeds again, working just as they should be. So, on to the lens. I'll start off trying to get as much of the dirt off as I can using a soft brush and the air blower. And with that done, it's time to remove the name ring. You can get friction tools for this job, but I just cut rubber discs and use whatever suitably sized cylindrical object that I can lay my hands on to unscrew the ring. Sometimes they can put up a bit of a fight, but in this case it's coming out nicely. Now it's time to unscrew the lock ring securing the front element or group using the trusty lens wrench. On some lenses the wrench will be perilously close to the glass itself and you don't want to slip and scratch said glass, but in this case there's loads of room to work. And there's our front group ready for dismantling. Another job for my random sheets of rubber is to provide friction to remove the front securing ring on this housing. Actually, that felt loose enough that I could have probably removed it with my fingers. I'll unscrew it the rest of the way by hand, being careful not to tip the glass out, because at this stage I don't know how many pieces of glass are inside, and I need to keep an eye on which way round they are as well. Then, for the same reason, I like to extract the glass elements using a suction tool rather than just tipping it into my hand, and place it on some clean soft cloth. Now for the cleaning of the optical elements. You'll get many people telling you different methods that you should or shouldn't use. I certainly wouldn't recommend the method I'm using here for your best lens. So if you want tips on cleaning lenses, I'd look for your ideal method elsewhere and formulate your own opinion from there. Initially I'll wash the element using distilled water. I want to float off any large bits of debris before trying to actually clean the lens. Once I'm happy that all the debris has been removed, I'll apply a mixture of about 70% IPA to 30% distilled water, using a new cotton bud for each step of the process. It's clear that this lens hasn't been loved for its entire life, and there are already marks in the coating, but it'll still work pretty well. I'll do this on both sides, and I'll usually make several passes over each side, using a new cotton bud every time, until I'm happy that it's clean. The final step is pretty similar, but this time I'll just be using distilled water and buffing the lens dry with the cotton bud. Before replacing any of the glass elements, I'll clean the entire housing with neat IPA to remove any remaining fungus, dust, dirt or whatever. Again, there are many people who'll say that you should use something like hydrogen peroxide to remove the fungus from a lens, so I'd highly recommend that you do your own research rather than just relying on what I'm doing here. So, with all the glass cleaned and reinstalled, it's time to sort the dried grease on the focusing helicoid. This is an Exakta fit lens, so it won't be quite the same on other mounts, but on this version there are 4 screws holding the mount in place. Once removed, the mount should lift off, having made a note of its orientation before removal. Next is the aperture ring, which just lifts off, being careful that you don't lose the tiny ball bearing that gives it its click. In this case it stayed stuck in place on the old grease. It's all too easy to lose your infinity position when dismantling a lens, so I like to wind the lens either to its infinity stop or to its shortest distance stop, as I have done here. Then put a mark so I know exactly where the focus ring was sitting. Then measure the length of the lens at this point. That way, if I do assemble it incorrectly, I'll know straight away rather than having to completely reassemble the thing and try it on a camera only to find that the infinity position is wrong. Next, I'll put a mark on the front of the lens in line with the mark I previously made, and then locate the tab that prevents the front of the lens from turning when you focus. This process will vary from lens to lens, but in the case of the Tessar, I can remove that tab and then I'll be able to extract the front of the lens from the inner helicoid. So, holding the focusing ring and the back of the lens, I want to gently unscrew the front of the lens, making sure I keep some outward pull so I know which position it releases from the helicoid. The helicoid has multiple start points, and if you start in the wrong place, your infinity position and distance scales won't be correct. It's better to go back over your steps to make sure you're happy before reaching that separation point, because it still comes as a surprise when it happens. And it's released. So without moving my hands or putting anything down, I'll just relocate that separation point. And once I'm happy, I'll put another mark on the front of the lens. In theory, this is the only mark I should need, because if I reinsert it at the right point, without moving the focusing ring, then it will go back in the same position. Now I can set about cleaning the dried grease off the helicoid. Meths is working for this lens, but it doesn't work on all greases. I'll also clean the other half of the helicoid, which is still attached to the focusing ring. On some occasions you'll also need to clean the outer helicoid. That one has a very fine thread and involves more marks and measurements, but in this case I've been able to rejuvenate it with a couple of small drops of oil and it's working fine. And now I've got a relatively clean helicoid, I can apply some fresh helicoid grease. I don't know exactly what grease this stuff is, but I'd be willing to bet that I paid well over the odds for this tiny container. But there's probably a lifetime supply in there, so maybe I can overlook the price for now. I just need a thin coating all the way around the helicoid, and then it'll be time for reassembly. Holding the front of the lens with the insertion point lined up, it should just screw back into the helicoid, but it can be pretty tricky getting it started. It will eventually go, and then it's just a case of screwing it in until the first mark lines up. Then the tab can be screwed back into place, at which point there's no risk of it all coming apart again. As a sanity check, I like to measure the length of the lens again, which in this case was the same as when I started, so it's all ready to go back together now. Okay, that was all a bit of a brief look at the repair process, and definitely not a how-to, but everything is now back together and the shutter speeds are all working as they should be. I won't put a film in the camera just yet because I've already got film in 3 other cameras and any more would be too much of an indulgence. I can of course pop the Tessar lens on a digital camera using an adapter, so here are a few shots. As expected, the 50mm Tessar lens takes great shots. These were a very popular and common lens at the time, and there are plenty available on the used market. I'm always partial to zebra lenses, so this one doesn't disappoint. Anyway, I think that's about it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.